Hey, Big John here, and you've picked a great time to listen to Dauphin Island Diaries. There's already a growing library of stories waiting for you. You can listen to all of our previous episodes, and you'll find extended interviews, including a nearly 2 hour conversation with Sherry Pope Moon, whose family story has a very unique connection to Dauphin Island. We're just getting started, and like I said, our catalog is growing. New episodes and interviews will continue to be added week by week, so when this episode ends, don't stop there. Scroll back through the archive and discover a few stories you may have missed. Now, let's get into the show. Welcome to Dauphin Island Diaries. This is a podcast dedicated to the history of Dauphin Island, Mobile Bay, and the Gulf Coast that surrounds it. Twice each month, we bring you a story about the people, the places, and the moments that have shaped this island, and the waters and coastline beyond it. Some of these stories are well known. Others have been buried by time and storms and shifting shorelines, but they're still here. So wherever you are, whether you're on the island, remembering it, or discovering it for the first time, find a comfortable place, take a deep breath, relax, and settle in, because this is one of those stories. The water was a little rougher than I expected as we made our way to the mouth of the bay. From where I was sitting, it felt like the winds were blowing in from one direction, the waves and current were coming from another, and then the wake from the vessel whose path we had just crossed was creating churn from yet a different direction. It made the Duke, the cruise vessel I'd ridden from Dauphin Island Marina out into the bay, to wallow and roll in just a bit of rather confused way. Not the regular predictable way I was more accustomed to experiencing. Or maybe I just wasn't used to the more open water of the bay. But even so, the sun was shining brightly and the sky was mostly clear. And so in spite of the weird chop going on, the day was otherwise perfect for a trip out to the Sand Island Lighthouse. I'd been waiting for this trip. Every time I tried to schedule a ride before on previous journeys down to Dauphin Island, for one reason or another, the trip was canceled. One time, really late into the season, there weren't enough paying customers to permit the crew to break even as they rode out to the island. And on another, for some reason, the Coast Guard had nixed the cruise. And so I'd made multiple trips down, including trips when it was out of season for the venerable old red cruiser / shrimp boat, and no trips were going out. And so I was excited finally to be going. And to be honest, I'd been afraid that a storm would finish the old girl off, the Sand Island Lighthouse, before I'd even get the chance to ride out and see her close up. I'd heard stories about how frail she was becoming, and I'd seen pictures that had given me pause. But the pictures and the stories, even then, didn't prepare me for what I was going to see when I got there. She's in worse shape than I'd allowed myself even to consider. I think everyone who has a soft spot in their hearts for lighthouses always hopes that every lighthouse can be saved. I'm not sure why they capture our imaginations the way they do. Maybe it's the idea of light from a lighthouse piercing the night, the spire rising from the shoreline, or from a tiny spit of riprap boulders in this case, and the light atop the spire being amplified into the darkness by the Fresnel lens. Or maybe it's the idea of a sailor navigating the rocks and shoals of coastal waters and having those identified through the beacon of the lighthouse. Or maybe it's the concept of a lonely sailor returning home after days or weeks or longer at sea, and the light from the lighthouse is like Tom Bodette leaving the light on for you. It tells you that you're almost to safety and comfort. Whatever it is, there are a lot of us who love lighthouses, and we always harbor hope for those familiar old structures who have strayed onto the endangered list. And frankly, the Sand Island Lighthouse is among the most endangered on the coast of the United States. And when the Duke finally took its position just a few yards away from the riprap breakwaters in place to protect the lighthouse foundation, I had the very close view that I'd coveted. And for a few moments, I even forgot I had a camera. I just stared. The light chamber at the top of the spire was long since devoid of its Fresnel lens and light fixture assembly, and the metal frame that had once provided structure for that full assembly as the old girl had beamed her rays into the night, that frame now looked like a shadow of itself. On one side of the building, a crack ran over half the height of the structure. She looked tired and old, and yes, frail. She not only looked as though she'd seen her better days, because she has, but she looked like she is truly living her very last days now. And that's when the title of today's episode began to form in my mind. I thought to myself, she stood watch out here at the mouth of the bay all these years, well over a century, but now she's not the Sand Island Lighthouse anymore. She's the Sad Island Lighthouse. Her condition is, to put it plainly, just sad. When I see magnificent old structures that are deteriorating, especially when that's due to a lack of maintenance, it saddens me. When those structures were once very important to a community, a city, a region, a vast segment of society, that's beyond simple sadness. That begins to become a tragedy. It's very important that we keep looking ahead and that we continue to create and to build, to improve, to progress, to keep driving to where we desire to go. But we lose our sense of direction when we don't also look back as well and see where we've come from. Holding on to those things of importance from the past and preserving them, not only for our own benefit, but also for that of our posterity, I think that's pretty important. And so how did we get to this point with the Sand Island Lighthouse, and what, if anything, can be done now that we're here? Well, to answer those questions, maybe it's good that we start at the beginning. So lighthouses themselves are a very, very old concept and type of structure. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, itself now lost forever in the fog of time, was once considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Dating back to nearly 300 BC, during the time when the Greek Diadochi had subdivided Alexander's Macedonian Empire, the Ptolemies of Egypt had built a massive lighthouse on the island of Pharos to guide ships into the port of Alexandria, Egypt, safely. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on Dauphin Island Diaries, there's another show you might want to check out, The Tennessee History Nerd. Same approach, different setting. Stories from across the volunteer state, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, let's get back to our story. And since before recorded memory, maritime commerce enabled the broad distribution of goods and materials, fish from the sea, wine from the vineyards, and a host of other goods that were produced in one area and then distributed and sold in another area, for which transport by water was often the most logical means of distribution. But the sea was sometimes a harsh mistress. Weather, the rocks and shoals of unfamiliar waters, and navigation without modern nav aids made maritime commerce, to the ancients, to be a difficult thing sometimes. The periodic discovery of Mediterranean cargo vessels still bearing amphora of wine and olive oil speaks to the uncertainty of maritime trade, even in well-traveled waters. The government of the young United States recognized these dangers. Even though advances in technology and navigational techniques and cartography and careful surveys had provided the means to document information and share knowledge more effectively among mariners, The fickle nature of the sea and the dangers of some waters meant that a nation whose existence, survival, and prosperity was tied to maritime commerce needed to try to assist such commerce by providing navigational aids such as were available at that time. And one such aid that was available was the venerable old lighthouse. So construction of lighthouses was initiated all along the coast from Maine all the way down the eastern seaboard. And in fact, some of those were built even long before the United States itself had come to be. The original Boston Light was completed in 1716, 60 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and it was destroyed during the American Revolution. It has a current structure built in 1783, a contemporary of the Sand Island Lighthouse, and it's an active, continuous lighthouse that's been operating there for over 300 years, according to the National Park Service. Okay, Big John, this is all quite interesting, but what about the Sand Island Lighthouse? Well, its genesis was in that early 1800s recognition of the need to provide navigational aids for all that maritime shipping. While the U.S. was expanding westward into the hinterlands during the first half of the 19th century, it had also, by the 1840s, acquired an Atlantic seaboard coastline that stretched from the tip of Maine to modern-day Brownsville, Texas. And that included the northern Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America if you prefer, where the entrance of Mobile Bay lies between Dauphin Island and Mobile Point, the Fort Morgan Peninsula. The first lighthouse on Sand Island wasn't a lighthouse at all. It was a spindle. In the spring of 1828, Congress authorized the placement of an iron spindle on Sand Island on the outer bar of Mobile Bay. This spindle was completed in 1830, and the cost of it was $600, which is almost $22,000 in 2026 dollars. And it was visible for about 6 miles. Now remember, at this time, Mobile Bay had only been in the hands of the U.S. since about 1813. This is about a decade and a half later. But sailors complained about the effectiveness of the spindle, or the lack thereof. And so in 1837, Congress allocated $10,000, nearly $350,000 in 2026 dollars, to build an actual lighthouse on Sand Island. This was built in 1838, and it was 55 feet tall. And in a rare feat for a government contractor, it came in under budget. Now, it wasn't as bright as the lighthouse that was on Mobile Point near Fort Morgan, and so it was considered a second-class beacon. But in 1848, one of the first documented reports of an issue that was to plague all the lighthouses was reported. In a coast survey that year, it was reported that, quote, Sand Island has lost a strip the whole length of the eastern shore from 66 to 100 yards in width. So even in the middle of the 19th century, the issue of erosion was a problem that plagued the Sand Island Lighthouse. By the 1850s, only about 15 years after the completion of the 1838 lighthouse, it was determined that this structure also was inadequate to meet the needs of maritime navigation in the area. And in 1856, Congress allocated $35,000, which is almost $1.4 million in 2026, for the construction of a second lighthouse on Sand Island. This lighthouse was built by Army engineer Danville Ledbetter to a height of 150 feet and provided light using a first-order Fresnel lens, a first-class lighthouse. Incidentally, the lighthouse at Pensacola came online the same month that Sand Island did, in January 1859. But this new lighthouse at Sand Island had a very brief life, and this time that was due not to the storms of the sea or the shifting of the soil beneath it. It was a casualty of war. The Confederates removed the light from the lighthouse shortly after the war began in 1861. Union blockaders replaced that light in December of 1862 and began using the lighthouse as a lookout point for observation activities, as a place to spy on the Confederates. In February 1863, a group of sappers from Fort Gaines under John W. Glenn placed 70 pounds of gunpowder under the lighthouse tower and ignited it, destroying the lighthouse. The report of this destruction was made to a brigadier general in the Confederate Army, General Danville Ledbetter, the very man responsible for its construction just a few years before. After the war, a third structure was created, a temporary 48-foot tall wooden structure. It would take 9 years before the permanent structure would be begun. If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place-based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. At this point, I think it's worth talking about the issue of erosion. The island's size has varied significantly over the years. Some reports from the early to mid 1800s speak of a 400-acre island and running cattle on it. Not sure why an island hosting a lighthouse required livestock. Maybe they wanted fresh milk. Now, to be very clear, I've heard that this is claimed, but I've not seen any photographical evidence of it. And in today's society, there's often a perspective of, quote, pictures or it didn't happen, end quote. And in a time when every Tom, Dick, and Harry walking around has a camera in his pocket on his cell phone, maybe that's understandable. But photography in the 1800s was a very different sort of animal. It required bulky, heavy equipment. It took time to set that equipment, which also was expensive, to get it set up. And the film employed was challenging to use and develop. So, no, there are no photographs of cattle running on the island that I can find. Not saying that they don't exist, but I don't have any. But regarding the erosion of the island, even if it was 400 acres at one point, it was constantly changing size. Literal drift added and then took away from the island. Every storm was sure to make some sort of changes to the island. The eroding shoreline of Sand Island required that the temporary structure, that temporary lighthouse that was built after the Civil War, had to be relocated not once, but twice before the permanent structure could even be started. And I say this to emphasize the fact that the island's constant changing is not only a function of the channel dredging today by the Corps of Engineers, though that hasn't helped, to be sure. But Sand Island's erosion issues were there even before the Corps of Engineers began dredging the Mobile Bay Channel. In 1871, the current structure was begun, and while that in and of itself was something of an odyssey, this is a good time to discuss the plans that were used because, due to the condition of the current structure, it's dangerous to explore the Sand Island Lighthouse now. It's not preserved, and it's not open for visitors to climb its stairs and look out on the water from the balcony outside its light chamber. But, much like one can look upon a surviving identical twin to see what his deceased sibling looked like, there are siblings to the Sand Island Lighthouse. In fact, it wasn't a twin. It was a quadruplet. One of the set of siblings is almost as endangered as Sand Island, and for much the same reason. The Morris Island Lighthouse in Charleston Harbor, Charleston, South Carolina, is also on an island that's eroding. And it's also unsafe for visiting and exploring, though its decay is not as advanced as Sand Island's. The other two siblings are in North Carolina, Bodie Island and Currituck Beach. These latter two are not only well preserved, they're also open for tourists to visit and explore. So while there are undoubtedly differences among the four of these structures, and certainly their vistas from the top are different, a visitor wanting to get a solid idea of what the actual structure of the Sand Island Lighthouse was like, or is like, while factoring in the corrosion and decay, can visit Currituck or Bodie Island and get a pretty reasonable understanding of what the Sand Island Lighthouse would be like today if it had been able to be adequately preserved. So the current structure was begun in 1871 using the same blueprint as those other three structures. Protection from the constant erosion required that the site of the current lighthouse be located over 200 yards from the previous structure. A very substantial foundation was laid with pilings to protect from that ever-present erosion. And given how the funds for the new structure were being allocated by Congress, this structure was built in phases. It was finally completed in April 1873 and was 132 feet tall. It was activated on September 1st of that year, and the two-story keeper's house was completed later that same month. One of the issues for many of the lighthouses constructed in this period is that they used, of necessity, the materials that they had readily available for their construction. Masonry requires mortar. Mortar requires sand. Well, of course, on Sand Island, there was no shortage of sand. But the issue with that sand is a problem known as salt contamination. Sand taken from a beach next to the ocean or the Gulf. For the record, I've had numerous people take pleasure in correcting me when I speak of Dauphin Island's beaches being next to the ocean, saying I don't know what I'm talking about. People, I know it's the Gulf. I'm speaking in generic terms when I say ocean. Anyway, sand taken from the beach is impregnated with salt. And this contamination can, over time, cause the deterioration of the mortar and weaken the structure. Today, engineers try to use sand that doesn't have that salt content. They use sand taken inland, away from the salt contamination, and the sand itself can be cleaned to remove those impurities. This wasn't generally as easily done in the 19th century, although the problem of salt contamination was already known and understood. Thus, to protect lighthouses from the effects of that salt contamination, they were painted or tarred. And often the paint scheme for each lighthouse was relatively unique, which is why people can quickly identify a lighthouse by its paint scheme. For example, Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, with its alternating black and white spiral bands. Check. Bodie Island, North Carolina, sister to Sand Island, with its horizontal black and white bands. Check. Pensacola, Florida, with its white base and black top. Check. And to be fair, some of these are similar to other lighthouses. For example, Pensacola is similar to Hunting Island, South Carolina. Same kind of paint structure. But the point of the paint is more about protecting the structure than providing an identity for the lighthouse. That latter happened more as a byproduct of the former, generally speaking. If you've been enjoying Dauphin Island Diaries, there's a way to take a little piece of it with you. We've got merchandise available, shirts, hats, and more, so you can represent the show wherever you go. You can check that out at summersmediaenterprises.com/merch. And as always, thanks for listening. And now, let's return to the story. For the Sand Island Lighthouse, we normally think of it today as that beautiful, rich, natural brick structure. But that's because after decades of neglect, it no longer retains any of its protective coating. And in part, this is why it's now in an advanced state of deterioration. In pictures from the 1800s, it was completely black. And that's because it was painted from top to base in coal tar to protect it. The tower could be protected from deterioration by coating it with coal tar, but protecting the island itself from the effects of erosion was proving to be more difficult. Riprap was added to the island repeatedly throughout the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. The keeper's house and fog bell tower were repeatedly forced to be relocated as the island eroded. In 1906, tragedy struck. A powerful hurricane hit the bay. The lighthouse itself survived, but the lighthouse keeper's dwelling did not, and neither did the lighthouse keeper. First assistant keeper Andrew Hansen and his wife Emma were lost in the storm. In another story that I posted a reel on Facebook about, and for which I was criticized, by the way, in 1919, passing ships noticed the lighthouse was dark. When an inspection party was dispatched to go to the lighthouse and investigate, the island was found deserted. Upon investigation, it was found that the keeper, John Reynolds, and the assistant keeper, William Emerson, had left a note, a log entry, that they were going to Fort Morgan to pick up a new assistant. They never arrived. The theory is that their boat capsized or was driven out to sea in rough weather. In spite of search attempts made at the time, no trace of them or their fate was ever found. And by way of clarification about that Facebook post, effective distribution of reels on Facebook generally require that they be less than a minute long, often in the neighborhood of 30 seconds. And it's nearly impossible to adequately share all the details of this kind of narrative in that length of time. I have to laugh at some of the comments people make when the specific detail that person thinks should be included in such a reel isn't there. C'est la vie. But contributing to the difficulties for keepers during this period is that they were being forced to live in the base of the tower. The keeper's house that was destroyed in the hurricane of 1906 wasn't replaced until 1925, 19 years later. But in 1925, that structure was finally built. Cast iron piles were secured in a concrete base adjacent to the tower, and a 2-story structure was constructed there. The bottom floor was used for housing machinery, and the second floor had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bath for the keepers. And again, during this period, more riprap was added to the island to try to stabilize the continuing erosion. In fact, records from the time indicate Sand Island itself had already migrated away from the location of the tower. By 1908, sources indicate that Sand Island itself was separated from the man-made riprap island on which the tower was located by a quarter of a mile. This phenomenon is something that's difficult for people sometimes not from the coast to understand. Barrier islands are constantly moving. The term for this phenomenon is literal drift. Now, that isn't literal drift in the sense of not figurative drift, though the pronunciation is pretty much the same. The term here looks like it should be pronounced littoral drift, but it's actually correctly pronounced literal. And what basically that means is that the ocean currents are always shifting the sands of a beach or a barrier island over time. And they actually move and change shape over time. And that's why building permanent structures on temporary land is temporary, or it requires somehow making the land itself to be more permanent. And that's how Sand Island itself migrated away from the Sand Island Lighthouse, and why the lighthouse no longer exists on an island of sand, but rather on an artificial island constructed almost entirely of granite riprap. And that's what it was, from what I can tell, even 100 years ago. In 1939, on the cusp of World War II, the responsibility of the country's lighthouses, including the Sand Island Lighthouse, was transferred to the United States Coast Guard. For the next 9 years, 3 Coast Guardsmen were assigned to the station, the Sand Island Lighthouse, until it was automated in 1948. But in 1947, just before it was destaffed, an incident with echoes of 1919's tragedy occurred. Edgar H. Osborne was a Coast Guardsman serving at Sand Island. He left Fort Morgan in a 21-foot craft in March of 1947 to return to the lighthouse with provisions, but he was caught in a sudden storm and his craft capsized. He was able to right the craft, but had lost the provisions and his engine was now waterlogged and wouldn't start. So now, with no power, he was at the mercy of the winds and waves, which capsized him twice more. After quite some time adrift in the Gulf, and I don't know how long that was, he was finally picked up by a Coast Guard cutter 5 miles south of Sand Island, where he was delirious and suffering from chills and frostbite. The next year, in 1948, Sand Island Lighthouse was destaffed and automated. And from 1948 until its deactivation in 1971, the Coast Guard maintained the light, but it was no longer actively, continuously manned by keepers. The Coast Guard made regular trips to the island to check the light, clean the lens, replace burned-out bulbs, make any necessary repairs, but its operation was completely automated. And then, in 1971, it was deactivated. At that time, the Fresnel lens was removed and placed on exhibit at the Fort Morgan Museum in 1972, and it can still be seen there today. In 1973, the keeper's house burned, evidently the victim of vandalism, according to some reports. It had stood on those cast iron pilings next to the tower since 1925. Today, those pilings, now rusted and bent, still rise up from the foundation next to the tower like fingers of a buried man trying to reach up out of the ground. And that brings us back to the present, to the tower that's still there, crumbling but stubbornly resisting the effects of time, weather, and waves. To the ever-diminishing knob of granite riprap that's all that's left of the island, once large enough to run a few head of cattle. And as sad as it is, and yes, the Sand Island Lighthouse perhaps now is best called the Sad Island Lighthouse for more than one reason. It is sad, but the island on which it is located is no longer Sand Island. Sand Island left that spot over 100 years ago. And yes, if you love the history of the tower there, and I do, then to see its current condition causes a melancholy mood. She continues to defiantly stand as a sentinel watching the mouth of the bay, but sometime, maybe the very next big storm, maybe 5 or 10 years from now, maybe with a sigh when the last grain of sand holding that critical piece of mortar finally slips away, she will eventually collapse. I know a lot of people would love to save her, but I honestly don't know that the will to do that is there. I'm pretty sure that the financial resources necessary to do it aren't there. And even if the tower could be saved, maintaining a stable foundation there for her is becoming more and more challenging. And so when she does eventually come down, it will be the epilogue, maybe, to the end of an era. That era maybe ended in 1948 when people stopped manning her. Maybe it ended in 1971 when she was decommissioned. Maybe it never ends as long as we continue to remember her and to talk about her. But she's been that silent sentry at the mouth of the bay now for a long time. She and 3 other lighthouses that preceded her there. And when she's gone, it's going to be strange to stand on Dauphin Island at Fort Gaines and look to the southeast and not see her spire against the horizon. And yes, at the risk of overusing that term, it definitely will be sad. And that's going to do it for this episode of Dauphin Island Diaries. In our next episode in a couple of weeks, we'll be headed up the bay and looking for ghosts. In this case, a ghost town. A place that for a brief time challenged Mobile itself for importance as a bayport, and then it declined and disappeared. The old town of Blakely. In episode 7, the ghost town above the bay. Hope you'll be watching for that episode to drop when we again explore where memories intermingle with the sand, the waves, and the wind. Until then, I'm Big John Summers, and these are Dauphin Island Diaries. May you enjoy fair winds today and a beautiful Dauphin Island sunset. Before we wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge the sources that helped make this episode possible. The principal source for this episode was Sand Island Lighthouse Chronicles by Warren Lee. If you've listened to today's episode, you've heard information that traces back to Warren's painstaking research into the history of the lighthouse, its keepers, the storms that battered it, and the long struggle to preserve it. That book served as the foundation for much of the historical narrative presented today. Additional information, photographs, and historical details were gathered from Lighthouse Friends, Lighthouse Digest, the United States Coast Guard Historical Archives, Encyclopedia of Alabama, Alabama Heritage, WKRG News 5, Lighthouse Hunters, and other historical lighthouse resources. I also consulted A History of Dauphin Island Under 5 Flags by Francis Young for local historical context and perspective. And finally, I'd like to thank the crew of the Duke for helping me finally make the trip out to see Sand Island Lighthouse for myself. Standing on the deck of the Duke, only a few yards away from that old tower, gave me a perspective no book, photograph, or website could ever fully provide. If you'd like to learn more about the Sand Island Lighthouse, I encourage you to visit the Fort Morgan Museum to see the original Fresnel lens. Stop by the Little Red Schoolhouse Welcome Center on Dauphin Island, where they have a good bit of information and material about the lighthouse. And support the organizations working to preserve Alabama's lighthouse heritage. As I always tell you, I'm very thankful for all the documentation and the work put into research and preservation of these stories, and to the historians, archivists, museum curators, and just regular folks who care so deeply about preserving these stories. I thank them for all they do and for enabling me to tell you these stories. And as always, thanks so much for listening. Hey, Big John here again, and I wanted to tell you that one of the things I love about podcasting is that it allows you to take me wherever life takes you. Whether you're driving to work, walking the beach, mowing the yard, sitting in an airport, or heading out on a road trip, Dauphin Island Diaries can go right along with you there. So if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following the podcast on your favorite platform. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and just about everywhere podcasts are available. And while you're there, I'd sure appreciate it if you consider leaving a rating or a review. It helps more people discover the stories of Dauphin Island and the Alabama Gulf Coast. And so, as always, thanks so much for listening.